InFi, episode 16.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance, hosted by American economist and author Dr. Robert Murphy. Each week, tune in for dynamic discussions with business pioneers about emerging trends in finance, life insurance, asset management, technology, and more. Now, let's talk the future of finance.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today is a very pleasant, fun episode. We're going to be speaking with Dominic Frisby. He is yet another person that I met over in London recently when I went to the ARC conference hosted by Jordan Peterson and others. So Dominic is, I'll just read from his official bio and then I'll give some more inside baseball. Dominic is a comedian from London who, oddly, doubles as a financial commentator, having written about markets since 2007. His Substack, The Flying Frisbee, is one of the most popular financial Substacks in the UK. He's authored 3 books, including in 2014, Bitcoin, The Future of Money, which was the first book on Bitcoin from a recognized publisher. His book on the past, present, and future of taxation, Daylight Robbery, won widespread praise. According to the Times, he is, quote, outstanding. The Telegraph says he's, quote, excellent. The Spectator says he is, quote, mercurially witty, and even The Guardian admits he, quote, can be entertaining. And I, Bob Murphy, say he can be, quote, quite a guest on the InFi podcast. Now, let me give you folks a little bit of guidance to what you're going to experience in this episode. So as the bio there suggests, Dominic is actually a jack of many trades. I won't say all, but many. So he actually is a professional comedian, but he also writes a lot and talks a lot on financial matters. And among other things, he's got a bunch of very entertaining and well done, like professionally done, satirical music videos on one of his podcast channels, or his YouTube channel, I meant to say. So what we're going to do here is right now, we're going to give you a little clip from one of his satirical songs, and then we're going to dive into the actual interview where we are quite serious and talk mostly about gold and, you know, the future of finance with respect to various major economic blocks around the world and what currencies they may embrace and such, and whether they're going to be gold backed. And then at the tail end, we'll have another little clip teaser from another of his funny songs. Okay. So of course, if you want links to see how you get access to all the different sides or personas that are all encapsulated in the one Dominic Frisby, we'll put links here at the show notes page. Without further ado, here's my discussion with Dominic Frisby.
Purchase you make, every transaction or decision you take. If you are not doing wrong, what is there to hide? How you spend money is for us to decide. Your social credit rating, how do you score? If you are compliant, you will get your reward. You may only own what we deem you can own. If you don't register, we'll block your phone.
Dominic, welcome to the InFi podcast.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, as people can probably tell, you're not from the southern United States. You're from your accent. So you and I actually met over at the ARC event, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, hosted by Jordan Peterson et al. Can you maybe just explain a little bit of your background to our listeners so they understand where you're coming from?
Yeah, well, as you can tell from my accent, I'm from Alabama. And I'm London from England, and I have a weird background in that I began my career as a comedian and voiceover, and that's kind of what I still do now. But around about 20 years ago, we were trying to raise the money for a project, and there were all these very clever people talking on the internet, and I was trying to work out a means to talk to them to find out how to make the money that we needed for this project. This was a musical. we needed like £5 million, which would have been $10 million at the time to bring it into the West End. So I started a podcast as a means to talk to them so I wouldn't have to pay them for their time. And I found everyone's very willing to come on podcasts. They certainly were on those days because there weren't as many, and people were quite happy to promote their own little brand and so on. And so the very first podcast I did was interviewing Jim Rogers. So talk about diving in at the deep end.
Oh, wow. Sure. Mm-hmm.
And then it was people like James Turk and Jim Dines. And this is, as I say, in the mid-noughties. And I became convinced that the place to put money was gold and commodities. And as a result of investing in gold, I started reading about money and how fiat money works and how money is created and how fiat money is evil and limited government and how gold puts a restraint on government and gold is the way by which the citizen can hold the government to account and all that stuff. And for the first time in my life, I became interested in politics and I became a rabid libertarian. And I've since authored the Libertarian National Anthem, which I'm very proud of. And one of the people I interviewed was a lady called Merrin Somerset Webb, who was editor of a magazine called Money Week. And she said, we need people to come like you to come and write for us. And suddenly, before I knew it, I was a financial writer. And I said, I don't really know what I'm talking about. And she said, that doesn't matter. And I've since discovered that it doesn't. So that's a sort of roundabout route of, so now I'm sort of financial writer and comedian. And that's how I ended up where I am.
Well, great. Yeah, there's a couple similarities in our respective stories because, I started out my career as I just thought I was going to be a college professor teaching economics in the classroom. And I wouldn't have dreamed of like speaking to real people about money and the stock market and stuff like that because I just thought, there's so many moving parts and who could. And what got me over that reticence was not that I became more confident in my abilities. It's that I saw everybody else who was talking to the public about the stock market and realized, I can at least give them better information than these clowns can. So that was sort of what happened.
There's a brilliant book written about Hollywood by William Goldman, who is a fantastic writer, wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and various other films, All the President's Men. And one of the phrases that you take away from his book is, nobody knows anything. And he's just said that's when it comes to films and the entertainment industry, you just don't know what's going to work and what isn't. Obviously, you can make educated guesses and use good people and all the rest of it. But ultimately, nobody knows anything. And the same applies to finance. The same applies to everything.
Yeah,
nobody knows anything.
I think it was Dick Clark who told Bobby Darin when Bobby Darin was going to do the song Mac the Knife. And he told him, what are you doing? That's like not at all like the other, fun songs you've been doing. It's not going to be a big And of course, it was like, his biggest hit of all time.
Yeah, I mean, that's happened time and time again.
So
if you were a commissioner, a TV commissioner in 2008, and you went, right, I'm going to commission 2-minute cat videos. That's what I'm going to commission. Just random people showing their cats. You would have just gone, are you mad? And yet, I think those are the most watched videos in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe how-to videos it might be slightly more watched as a group, but singularly cat videos.
Yeah. Also, too, if somebody had described how Twitter works, like let's make it so you can't type very much at a time and everyone's just going to flock there to communicate with each other where like we're deliberately handcuffing you. I would have thought that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard of it yet.
Yeah, but Twitter's done this new thing where you can write longer posts.
Well, they've evolved, yes.
And I'm like, oh, God. Because you start reading a post, you go, oh, that's interesting. And then you click on it, and then he's got like some long essay, and you're like, I haven't got time for that.
Right,
you just want the short, pithy, argumentative stuff.
What made Twitter so great in the first place?
Yeah.
So anyway. I see hanging behind you, you were talking about gold, but you've also now got posters about Bitcoin. So did you take the plunge into that?
I wrote the first book on Bitcoin in 2013-14 from a proper publisher, from a recognized publisher.
Yeah.
But it came out in the first crypto winter, so it never got distributed in the US, proper distribution. But it was quite a big hit in the UK, sold a lot of copies. And that other book you can see there, that's Daylight Robbery. That's my last book. And that's all about the past and present of taxation and the future of taxation. And if you're asking me, how do we save the world? Like, I'm all for all the arguments that are going on, all the culture wars, and everyone has to fight their particular battle and all the rest of it. But if you said to me, what are the zero patients? What is patient zero? And by patient zero, I mean, it's a trope of a zombie film. Patient zero is where the virus starts and the hero has to get to patient zero and kill him, or patient zero's got the antidote, or he has to kill out patient zero to defeat the virus. And patient zero, for me, with everything that's wrong in the world, there are two patient zeros, but there's a big intersection between the two of them. One is our system of money. We need independent money. We need a system of money that governments can't create or nobody can create at no cost to itself. Because if one body in a society can create money at no cost to itself and everyone has to work to create it, then you have an imbalanced society straight off the bat. And that's what we've got with fiat money. And two is our system of tax. We don't tax things equally. Our tax system creates inequality because we tax labor, we don't tax capital, and all the rest of it. And you design a society the way you tax it. And so tax and money, and there's obviously a lot of crossover between the two, but for me, they're patient zero. And I've written 2 books about money, Life After the State and Bitcoin, and then I've written Daylight Robbery, which is all about tax.
Okay, well, we've had plenty of guests making the case for Bitcoin and, that being a separate system. And here at Infineo, we're trying to, again, come up with more general rails for using distributed ledgers and so forth in order to democratize the transfer of wealth and such. But can you speak? We have the only tax episode we've had recently. I don't know if this is on your radar, Dominic, but there's a Supreme Court case, the Moore case, having to do with unrealized gains, and depending on how the defendant's making a pretty novel argument, and so that's some tax issues. But can you just speak more generally about what do you mean that the tax code is being used to redesign society and such?
Well, I don't know the specifics of that case, but I've read little hints about it. The idea of taxing unrealized gains is just absurd.
Yeah.
Because what happened, if it's unrealized, you don't know what the gain is. And let's say I get taxed, I make 100% on a trade, or it's up 100%. But if I don't cash out on the trade, there's no gain. So how can you tax unrealized gains? What happens if I then pay tax on the gain and then the trade comes back and I only break even on the trade? Well, what happens to I've lost money on the tax? It's just nuts. The thing people don't realize about taxes is in order to work, they have to be practical. It's one of Adam Smith's golden rules. It's unfortunately one of the reasons that income tax works so well, because it's easy to collect. A tax on unrealized gains, and in fact, wealth taxes generally are very hard to collect because they're hard to prove and they get contested. Whereas income taxes are deducted for the most part at source. So they're easy to collect. Same goes for sales taxes. That's why governments like them. 50% of government revenue around the world derives from income tax, and more in the first world. And for me, well, there's umpteen problems with our system of tax. First thing, we are taxed too much. Secondly, if you're a young person starting out in life, all you've got is your labor. And we tax labor relentlessly, and we tax it heavily. 45% in the UK, higher rate. And it just means that your chances of rising up the ladder are just cut off right at the head, right at the starting point, because you have half of your proceeds taken from you. Then you're paid in money that loses its purchasing power to inflation, 10, 12, whatever the rate is, % a year. And that's another relentless tax. And then people wonder why there's such a gap between old and young. Income tax is built into income tax. It creates inequality. And so if Dominic Frisby was designing libertarian idyll, I like the idea of subscription taxes, which are voluntary taxes where if you want the service, you pay for it. If you don't want the service, you don't have to pay for it. And people go, well, it wouldn't work. Well, it's worked in the past. The ancient Greeks had voluntary taxes. Liturgy worked for them. Pretty enlightened society, the ancient Greeks. And if you look through history, the most enlightened, the most innovative, the most inventive, the most brilliant societies have always been societies where taxes are low. Because tax is a measure of freedom. The less you tax somebody, the more economic freedom they have, the more of their own labor they own. And you can't have freedom without economic freedom. The two are closely intertwined. And the most heavily taxed society of all would be a slave society, because the slave doesn't own his own labor. He doesn't even own his own body. A totalitarian society, North Korea or something, the worker has no ownership of his own work. That's one extreme. And then the other extreme is Ancapistan, no taxes at all. And depending on who I'm hanging out with, I waver between classical liberal small state, 10% of GDP, a number that derives from the tithe, 10%. And by the way, it's the tithe 10% because we have 10 fingers on our hand. It's an easy number to calculate. And I waver between 10% and 0% total ANCAP, everything privately owned, subscription taxes, voluntary taxes, and all the rest of it. We probably haven't got the time to explain it here and now, but one of the things I argue for in that book is land value tax. But I argue for it at the expense of all other taxes. So you would pay no other tax apart from land value tax. And you wouldn't pay it on your house, you'd pay it on, or any improvements you make to your land, you'd pay it on the land itself, the rental value of the land itself. And that's the old Henry George idea. Right. Milton Friedman called it the least bad tax. I'm sure your listeners know all about it. And that kind of creates a voluntary society by accident. Some libertarians who I talk to hate it, but I quite like it. But it's a nice idea in theory, but we're never going to see it in practice because one, it's too difficult an idea to explain. And two, it's too difficult an idea to implement unless you have some kind of revolution. And three, what's most likely to happen is some kind of awful bastardization where we get land value tax in addition to other taxes instead of to replace other taxes, which is like worst of all worlds. But in any case, as a purist, idealist, I argue for it, though I recognize as a realist that you're not going to see it as it was intended to be.
Okay, well, just to unpack that a little bit, is your thinking that, hey, other types of taxes that are in a sense penalizing socially desirable behavior, like a standard income tax, it's the more you work, you're getting penalized more. If you save, and then, the dividends and interest are taxed, well, then that's penalizing savings and so on. Whereas if it's a pure land tax, like you're saying, so you don't want to tax the full value of the property with any buildings because that discourages people from putting up a nice building and whatever. They get implicitly punished the more they create. But you're just saying the raw underlying, that geographical location, it's worth such and such. That's not so much due to human effort. And so you're not hurting incentives of what you want people to be doing by taxing that, given that you need a revenue source from something.
That's exactly what I'm saying. The unimproved value of the land. And your point is you don't want to tax behaviors that is good for society. Work is good for society, so we should not be taxing it.
Right.
You could argue that consumption is less good for society, and therefore maybe there's more of a case to argue to tax consumption than there is. Certainly it's less good than work if you have that sort of old school Protestant worldview, which I sort of do have. I mean, economists today are obsessed with getting people consuming more.
Right.
We will end up in a bad way. But in any case, you could argue that land hoarding is consumption and that land value tax is a consumption tax. But yeah, you should tax the land in its unimproved state. And it derives from a group of, I think they were French, 18th century philosophers called the physiocrats, or they were certainly European, Western European.
They were French, at least the beginning, they were French.
Okay.
Yeah.
And their idea was that nature gave us the land. The land isn't there because of anyone's endeavor and hard work. It was given to us by God or Mother Nature or whoever the primary power is. And therefore, it should be shared by all. If you do something to the land, you turn it into a farm, or you build a mine, or you build a house, or you build a factory or something, then you have improved it. And the value of the improvements should belong to the person who took the risk, or the person who since bought the endeavors of the person who took the risk. But the land itself was always there. And if you want exclusive rights to it, then you should pay a rent to the community that gives, and you want the government to protect your rights, then you pay a rent to have exclusive rights to this land. So that's the idea philosophically. And I like the idea that we all own the land. It goes back to the sort of nomads of the desert nomads or the Kalahari tribesmen or something like that. And we were originally nomadic once upon a time in the good old days.
Yeah, all right. Okay, so insofar as the subtitle of this podcast is The Future of Finance, given that your book on taxation, do you have any, you can also then give your commentary, but just your neutral prediction about where tax codes are going? Like, I know it was a big thing a few years ago when they kind of the U.S. authorities broke down the walls of the Swiss bank accounts, and, like a lot of the historical privacy got battened down. There's a lot of talk about equalization, and we got to get rid of tax havens and such. So anyway, do you have any thoughts on what the international landscape looks like for taxation going forward?
I think there has been a battle between taxpayer and tax collector since history began.
Mm-hmm.
And we have been taxing people since history began. The very first written records we have are accounts of taxes owed. That's how old taxes are. I'm afraid, as Mr. Franklin said, they are as inevitable as death.
Mm-hmm.
And that battle, that dance, that struggle, it's going to continue. But the new planes on which that battle are going to be fought, new technology, the digital world, and all the rest of it. But as we're talking about the future of finance, I see like fiat money, fiat currencies are flawed. They're gravely flawed. And because there's no limit to how many can be created. And with increased surveillance, particularly as we go into central bank digital currencies and all of that, they're only going to become more flawed. And the technology is there to use non-government money now. I think there are, 5,000 different crypto coins or something, of which Bitcoin is the best. And fiat money is limited by borders. Even the US dollar, which is the global reserve currency, if you're outside of the US and you're an individual, it's quite hard to get a US dollar account. If you're in Africa or Asia or somewhere, it's really hard. Mm-hmm. Even the UK citizen to get a US dollar account is just problematic. It's not. You can't just get one like you can in your local currency. But national currencies are limited by borders, by the size of those economies, by the wealth of that country. They're limited in scalability and reach. Whereas we now have the borderless medium that is the internet, or the largely borderless medium that is the internet, and we have the ability to send and receive money instantaneously to like 1/100th, 1,000th of a penny, payments that small, to payments of trillions of dollars, can be just sent instantaneously over the internet thanks to Bitcoin. Maybe not trillions of dollars, but billions of dollars. And that technology is incredible, and it's a finite currency whose value therefore grows each year because it's a deflationary currency. So there's a scalability to Bitcoin that just doesn't exist to fiat money. There's also not so much Bitcoin, but you can have anonymity and privacy if you want. The government can say to you, you've got to hand over your records, and you might face jail if you don't hand over your records, but it's very difficult to them to prove how many Bitcoins or how many Monero or whatever it is you own compared to how many US dollars or pounds you own, because there just isn't the same level of privacy, and the banks are the agents of the government. And the banks will do whatever the government tells them in order to stay in business. The government is more important to them than you, the customer. So as this dance between taxpayer and tax collector goes on, you will see more and more people move into these non-government currencies, which are better. They're better forms of money technologically. They're better forms of money because they're better savings vehicles. They're better spending vehicles, particularly as more and more people start to accept them. So I think we're inevitably going into a future, and gradually you're going to see more and more corporations keeping their treasuries in Bitcoin. They're already starting to do it. MicroStrategy's the sort of leader there, but others are following. You're going to see more stateless individuals and more stateless activity genuinely. And that means, like, the government finds it very difficult to regulate the digital economy Google can put its trademarks in one country and its revenue in another country and its IP in another country, and Starbucks can do the same, and it can fiddle its accounts, and it ends up paying very little tax relative to its market cap or relative to its turnover. And governments have really struggled to find ways to address that. Trump had a sort of repatriation thing that actually worked quite well. But generally speaking, corporations that use the digital economy have been quite difficult to tax. And it's very difficult to get unanimous tax coordination internationally. There's all sorts of bodies that are trying to achieve it, but inevitably one government is at a different time, and if it's electoral cycle, or one government has a different worldview or whatever, so it's quite difficult to coordinate. And so there are different tax laws in different countries. The EU is trying to stop it, but so that's another direction that we're going in. But as a result of all this, governments find it a lot easier to tax the physical economy because the tax system is built around a 19th century industrial revolution economy where workers, place of work, product of work were all in one place. Factories, roads. It's quite easy to tax goods coming in and out of the country. Digital economy is just a different kettle of fish altogether. And that's where the new battleground is. And so I think you'll see people trapped in the physical economy actually being taxed more and persecuted more, while you'll see a sort of new class of sovereign individuals, digital nomads, whatever you want to call them, who are kind of stateless above the whole system. And these are all trends, I think, we've been seeing them for a few years, and I just think they grow.
Okay,
and
great.
The more you tax the physical economy, the more people you push into statelessness.
Right. And it's sort of like a downward spiral that the more people that do migrate away, then the revenue from the existing tax rate on the physical economy goes down. So then they have to tighten up the vice even harder because, well, we got to raise more money, and then it just causes more people to flee.
And the institutions that they are raising money for are getting increasingly incompetent. Partly because, there's all sorts of reasons for that. Government institutions are inherently incompetent anyway, but then all the sort of politicization of these institutions that's gone absolutely nuts in the last 5 or 10 years means that in many cases, the best people aren't being hired anyway. So that just means the institutions are less good, and they've just become greater black holes of capital. And then so much capital is wasted just trying to keep various groups happy, whether it's, ESG or green narratives or diversity. Now, it doesn't matter what the religion is. They're all vortexes of capital.
Right.
And as they suck more capital away, more people are just going to go, I'm not paying for that. And so they'll take steps to become stateless.
Now, when you say that, do you mean, are you picturing people who still, for example, live in London, but their businesses, they can just do it over the internet? Or do you mean people I know there's a trend, some people just start living on cruise ships and they are literally not a member of, they might have some passports, but they technically don't reside in any country.
Yeah. Well, you couldn't do that in London. I couldn't live in London. I couldn't go, I'm no longer English, and live in London. I can leave England or Britain and go, and then after a year, I can say to the UK tax authorities, I haven't been in England for the last year. I'm not paying tax to England in the last year because my revenue is not in England. I'm working in Dubai or something. And they would accept that. You can't do that if you're American.
Right.
Because Abraham Lincoln, the Godfather, introduced this law in 1861, I think, during the Civil War, when he was, one of the arguments I make, by the way, in Daylight Robbery is that that Civil War was all about tax and protecting union tax revenue. But in any case, one of the laws he brought in if you were an American in any part of the world, you still had to pay your taxes to America, wherever you are in the world, wherever you worked, if you wanted to retain your American citizenship. And this was just to protect union tax revenue during the war. But like most laws, it got introduced. And then once the law's introduced, it just stays there and it never gets taken away. This is another reason why governments are getting increasingly incompetent, because every year more rules and regulations get added to and nothing ever gets taken away, or very little. So the more stuff there is, the more expensive everything gets. But anyway, Lincoln introduced that law. And so Americans if Americans want to go and be digital nomads, you actually have to renounce your citizenship, which is quite a big ask. But for other countries, I could stay English, but not be an English taxpayer if I'm not living in the UK.
Okay, great. Something you said there was almost a throwaway line, but I didn't realize you said that if you, like someone living in London, let's say you're working for an American corporation, and you would just prefer to be paid in US dollars, that it's denominated in your bank's checking account as US dollars. You're saying that's actually not an easy thing to get set up?
No, it's not. And if I was living in London, and I do live in London, but I was working for a US corporation full time, they would have to pay me in pounds and the tax would be deducted at source. Mm-hmm. If I was working freelance in London for an American corporation, and I said to them, I want to be paid in dollars, I could give them US dollar bank account details and they could pay me in US dollars, but I would still then have to declare that money to the UK tax authorities and pay tax on it. But the difference between the freelancer and the full-time worker is that the freelancer has to declare his earnings and then pay tax on them, whereas the full-time worker, his taxes are deducted at source.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I mean, certainly the tax element, but I even meant just in general, the choice of which money you want to hold. Your point was you making the point that fiat currencies aren't as convenient as decentralized private sector ones.
And I'll give you an example. It's really not easy, but which currency you choose to hold is so important. And I'll give you an example. Like, Americans all complain about the devaluation of fiat money and inflation and all the rest of it. But in 2007, it was $2.10 to the pound. Now it's $1.20. So even with all the depreciation in that you've seen in the US dollar, the pound has decreased by almost 50% against the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
So the UK to an American is just so cheap at the moment. And everyone goes, oh, that's really good because it means foreign money comes into the country and you get investment and all the rest of it. But it also means locals are devalued. And it's really hard to escape the sort of vortex of the expense of modern life and property, trying to buy property and everything, if the money you're paid in is just crap. And if I'd done the same work 10 years ago and been paid in Bitcoin or even in gold rather than in pounds, I'd be so rich now. I could buy, I could probably retire. But let's say the average UK salary is 30 grand a year, 35 grand a year. If I'd been paid 35 grand a year in Bitcoin or 35 grand a year in gold, I'd dread to think how rich I'd be. But the average worker's not paid 35 grand a year in Bitcoin. He's paid 35 grand a year in local currency, which is crap. And so he's just stuck in this rut.
It's funny you said I didn't think of that until later, because I had when I met you, that was my first time in the UK, Dominic, and for some reason I had it in my head that, everything's going to be really expensive over in London. And I was pleasantly surprised the restaurants or whatever, and I'm doing the math, like, no, that's actually, to me, not a big deal. So I guess it's partly what you're talking about.
London's an expensive city, but to an American, it's as cheap as it's ever been.
Yeah, okay. So that does explain that, I wasn't wrong for thinking that was a general thing, but my particular visit, I was pleasantly surprised. Okay, so we're talking a lot about gold, and that's, I know, something that you're an expert on, and particularly China. So let me give you the quick backdrop of my quick dabbling in this area. So Dominic, I think I mentioned this to you. I had been commissioned by the magazine Chronicles to write an article on the fate of the US dollar. And they meant particularly like as a world reserve currency. And one of the lines of research that I looked into was the official gold holdings of the various governments around the world. And I noticed that the US from 2000 to 2022, the latest figures that I had access to, basically they said something like they had like 8,300 tons of gold in the official reserves. Whereas the Chinese authorities, it had like quintupled or something from like a 400 or something and up to more than something like 2,200 tons. And so I was like, hey, this is kind of a big discrepancy. And plus there's rumors that the U.S. actually doesn't have all that gold, that they're like maybe shorting it into the market to suppress, who knows. So there's always claims like that. That's why they resist audits and things, because, hey, if we went in there Fort Knox and looked around, or the New York Fed, we'd find that actually those vaults aren't filled to the brim with gold like they say. That's what the Alex Jones types say. So that's where I was. And then you told me that, no, with your research, you think the Chinese actually have a lot more than what they're officially declaring. So can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, I can. The Chinese have at least twice as much gold as America does. Twice as much. I'm sure of that. And I often think about gold. What is the point of it? Everyone could say it's natural money. I've got a little gold necklace that I wear. Gold is indestructible. And gold was in the dust which formed the solar system. So that means this little bit of gold that's hanging around my neck is not just older than the Earth itself, it's older than the solar system. And so touching this little gold that I'm touching now, that is the closest I will ever come to touching eternity. And I think it's a very profound thought. It's the most incredible substance. It's the very first metal that human beings used. We would have found there's a lot more surface gold in the Stone Age, and we would have found bits of golds we hunted and gathered, nuggets in riverbeds and so on. And we would have worn it, displayed it. Look at me, I've got this lovely necklace, mate with me. Look, aren't I a high status guy? We would have used it as barter, as a reward, as a prize, all the rest of it. So exactly the same things we use it for today. Store wealth, display wealth, show accomplishment, show prowess, all the rest of it. So and it's a beautiful thing, gold, and I argue that human beings actually have an instinct for gold. It is the instinct for gold is the oldest commercial instinct of the human race, the first commercial instinct almost of the human race. So that's quite a profound anthropological connection we have with this extraordinary metal. But then again, you can go, well, the horse was transport for thousands of years, and then they invented the motor car, so we no longer need the horse. Isn't gold just the same? And gold's future is just as jewelry. That's all. Maybe a few weirdos on the internet will say we're going to go back to a gold standard, but apart from them, it's just jewelry. Maybe a few others, a little bit of insurance as well. Nobody else's liability, money outside of the system. Maybe that's the future of gold. Jewelry and a little bit of insurance. Possibly. If we're going into the world of where Bitcoin's probably done more than anything to expose the fraud of fiat currency, it's been the most wonderful educative tool in that regards. Children, kids the world over, just through memes and just by buying Bitcoin, the under 30s, the under 40s, the under 20s just have an understanding of inflation and fiat money and all its evils that you couldn't have taught them in the schools. It's just happened because of Bitcoin and all the associated stuff that comes with it, cryptocurrencies and all the rest of it. But if you look at governments around the world, most of them don't own cryptocurrency, but they all own gold. So given the choice between gold and cryptocurrency, they're going to favor the one that they own. They favor the one they have more control over. They're going to favor the one that human beings have an instinct for. So even though gold is a sort of anti-state money, it's actually going to have governments on our side in the sort of what is going to be the money of the future. And then you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is basically all the countries along the Silk Road. India to the south, Russia to the north, China to the east, the Arab nations to the west. Not all of them are friends of the United States. In fact, most of them are enemies of the United States. The United States uses the dollar as a tool of war, and countries have always used money as a tool of war. We did it against the Germans in World War II. But obviously they've shut Iran out of the financial system, they shut Russia out of the financial system. All those countries, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, central bank gold buying for 2 years now has been at its highest rate since the 1960s. Who's buying the gold? all countries along the Silk Road, for the most part. Why are they buying gold? Then you look at Chinese treasury holdings, 1.2 trillion a few years ago. In just a few years, every month, they're just coming off a little bit. We're at 800 billion now. They've come off by a third. But China does it incrementally, month by month. So it's like a frog torch or whatever they call it.
And just so people understand, you're saying that Chinese holdings of U.S. Treasury securities is eroding.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Their US dollar holdings have come off about 5%. They've still got $3 trillion US dollars. So China isn't ready to go, we don't want to use the US dollar anymore, because it's got 3 trillion of them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not ready for a confrontation with the United States. We all know it's coming sooner or later, but it's not ready yet. At the moment, if they went to war, it'd probably be about equal. There's no clear victor. Maybe China in 5 or 10 years will be the bigger superpower, but at the moment it isn't. But since 2000, China has been accumulating extraordinary amounts of gold. Now, officially, America has 8,100 tons, and it's stored in Fort Knox. Now, a lot of conspiracy theorists say it isn't there because it hasn't been audited in 60 or 70 years. And the joke is the head of security says to the US president, Mr. President, there's no gold in Fort Knox. And the president says, what do you mean there's no gold in Fort Knox? And the head of security says, there's no gold. And the president says, double the guard. And, that's quite a thoughtful joke. Why will America not have its gold audited? Another theory is simply that the bars just aren't up to modern quality standards. But in any case, that gold hasn't been audited. But let's assume they do have it. 8,000 tons. Remember that figure. China says it has 2,100 and something tons. Every month at the moment, they're just a bit like its treasuries are coming down, their gold holdings. They're declaring them every month. And every month, they're like 30 or 40 tons more than they were a couple of months ago. And again, they're just like drip feeding the information in. At 2,100 tons is saying it has roughly a quarter of what America has. Now, the motto of China is, we must not shine too brightly. That's the mentality. And for all the noise you hear about everything, they actually keep out of, they don't shine that. It's Russia's done this and Iran's doing that and Saudi Arabia's doing this, but China's sort of, it's fairly humble. It just makes stuff and gets on with it. It's not making big pronouncements. In 2007, China became the largest producer of gold in the world, the largest miner of gold. It overtook South Africa in 2007. And if you look at geological records, since 2000, in the 23 years since 2000, China has produced 7,000 tons of gold, give or take. More than 50% of Chinese gold mining is state-owned. Okay? No gold. China doesn't export its gold. It's not allowed to export it. So all the gold that's mined in China stays in China. 7,000 tons, more than half state-owned. But the People's Bank says it's only got 2,000 tons. In addition to being the world's largest producer, China is the world's largest importer. And you can't prove how much gold it's imported because a lot of the gold goes through Dubai, where it's private, through Switzerland, London, where the deals are private. We know what goes through Hong Kong, but nowhere else. But we do know that some, not all, but some of the gold that goes to China goes through the Shanghai Gold Exchange. And we also know that since 2000, 23,000 tons of gold have been withdrawn from the Shanghai Gold Exchange. That's not all the gold that's gone to China. It's just some of it. Probably more than 50% of it, but it's not all of it. A lot of it, the 400-ounce bars don't go through the Shanghai Gold Exchange, for example. But we know 7,000 tons mined, 22,000 tons imported, And there was already 4,000 tons of gold in China in the year 2000, jewelry and central bank holdings. So that's 33,000 tons of gold in China minimum, probably more, because of, as I say about the imports, 33,000 tons minimum. And then you go, okay, how much of that figure is state-owned? And it's not just the central bank that owns gold. The army owns gold. The sovereign wealth fund owns gold. There's all sorts of other government bodies that own gold. But it's all still Chinese gold, Chinese national gold. And it's just not unreasonable to say that 50% of that gold is state-owned. Alistair MacLeod of Gold Money says it's more like 60%. Koos Janssen says it's more like 55%. Everyone's got their own theory, but just say 50%, low ballpark. 50% of 33,000 tons is 16,500 tons. Okay? That is twice what America has. Sorry, it is twice what America says it has.
Right.
16,500 tons. Now, if China just went, yeah, actually, we've got twice as much gold as you, that would be almost a declaration of war. Almost. And it would send the gold price to the moon, and it would completely devalue the dollar. Well, China's got $3 trillion. It's not ready for that type of confrontation yet. But if it ever wanted to weaponize its gold, it's got that card to play. But as I say, its motto is we must not shine too brightly. So it says it's got 2,000 tons, which is the sort of the minimum level that it could admit to having while staying vaguely credible.
Mm-hmm.
But really, it's got double. But if at some point it wants the yuan to become the global reserve currency, which it might well do, there has never been a global reserve currency in all of history that did not start out backed by gold and sometimes silver as well. They all got debased into oblivion. They all left the gold standard eventually, but they all started out backed by gold. And if China wanted to go, right, we want reserve currency status for the yuan, all it has to do is make it freely convertible into gold at a given price, because that way it would win global trust. It doesn't mean that every person that owns yuan is going to convert their yuan to gold. People just have to know that they could convert it to gold if they want it, as happened was the case with the pound and the dollar once upon a time. And instantly China wins trust. As I say, it's not ready to do that yet. It's not ready for that kind of confrontation, if indeed it ever wants it. But it's kind of inevitable that it will do. So it's just being discreet about it. But believe you me, China has twice as much gold as the US, at least. And I hope my argument has demonstrated how I've arrived at that conclusion.
Yeah, definitely. And so within like the insiders, like the people who write newsletters and whatever, is it well understood that China must be vastly understating their official reserves, and the debate is just over what are they holding, or is this still a novel approach that you're taking?
It's known. 3 or 4 of the gold newsletter writers cover it. There's me and a couple of others who've really, really audited it. There's some guys who say it doesn't have quite as much gold. There's one guy who says, what's his name? Koos Janssen says he thinks 5,000 tons. He thinks a greater percentage is owned by citizenship than 50%, but it's still way more than it says.
And even if it turned out to be like just that the people hold it, that's still significant. Just to know, like looking at China as an economic bloc, the fact that there is that much gold sitting within their borders, is significant.
Yeah, and China's told its citizens to buy gold. It's been encouraging them to buy gold since 2007. And the price at which it started encouraging them to buy gold's never gone beneath that price. And it's thought that China will defend that price in order to keep so that its citizens don't lose any money. And if China were ever to go to war, I'm sure if they needed to, citizens for the large part would turn in their gold as a kind of war bond.
Mm-hmm.
Citizens do that.
Right.
particularly loyal ones, and Chinese citizens, for the most part, are a lot more loyal than Western ones are.
Okay, well, so very interesting, and and I mean, you're obviously know much more of the details than I do, but yeah, my general thought, the more I study the two, is just that the Chinese authorities, not that they're nice guys or good guys, but they seem to be more farsighted than a lot of Western leaders, and just to say, you know what, why don't we just sit back and let these clowns kind of run their own countries into the ground, and then we'll say, hey, maybe we should kind of run the show.
Yeah, I mean, they must just be sitting there every time they think we better do something. Oh, actually, we don't need to do anything. The West is just going to destroy itself. We don't even need to do anything. It's just incredible. And the West is so short-sighted about everything. And I think symbolic of that is the buildings we build. The Victorians used to build buildings with legacy in mind. Now we just build buildings with short-term profit and adhering to building regulations. That's all we think about. Mm-hmm. We don't think of what are our children 300 years down the road going to think of us. We don't think of that. And the Chinese do. And it's a sign of a nation that's on the rise rather than one that's in decline.
Yeah, I can't remember now what I was reading, but somebody talking about how, in the Middle Ages, people would be building churches that wouldn't even be finished in their lifetime.
Yeah.
They was, just showing the far-sighted nature of what they were doing.
Yeah, and they'd just build like this wing or something. Yeah, and it's incredible how people thought. And I think a lot of it's to do with inheritance tax.
It is.
Because you think, well, it's not going to be mine or my kids anyway because the government's going to take it. I'm not going to bother.
Yeah. Well, the clock is dwindling here. So, Dominic, can you now, we focused on your sort of intellectual endeavors, but you crank out a bunch of really clever, entertaining videos. Can you speak to that? Maybe give us some ones that I can link to and, point people to?
Sure. Well, I write comic songs, and there's a video called Programmable Money, mm-hmm. which is all about CBDCs that I put out a couple of weeks ago that I think your listeners and your viewers might like. But if you want to find out more about me and what I do, my newsletter is called The Flying Frisby. Frisby is spelled Frisby. It just means Village of the People from the Frisian Islands, which is a group of islands off the coast of Holland and Germany in the Baltic. And so I guess that's where my ancestors came from once upon a time. But yeah, theflyingfrisby.com, that's my newsletter. And I'd be glad if your listeners and your viewers signed up. And there's lots of entertaining content and lots of thoughts about the markets as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll definitely link to the Programmable Money. Your Ancapistan video, I got a kick out of. And then you mentioned the Libertarian National Anthem. Is that?
Oh, yeah, that too, yeah.
Okay, so we'll do that. We'll certainly link to those folks here at the show notes page. Also, are you on tour? Did I see that?
Yeah, I'm doing a tour in March. And it's only a little one. We're just sort of testing the water to see if there's an appetite for my small state comedy outside of London. But I'm hoping there will be.
So where are the venues? Do you have that booked yet?
Just all across the south of the UK, Bath, London, Hampshire, Essex, and there's another one, and I can't remember where it is off the top of my head.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm sure. So any of our listeners who are in the area, for sure, you want to check that out. It'd be great. Well, our guest has been Dominic Frisby. Dominic, thanks so much for your time and your insights.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We cannot always help the thoughts that come into our head, but when a word is spoken, then it cannot be unsaid. It's only when you fire the gun that someone ends up dead. You can't recall an email. Once it's sent, it will be read. Please, please, please don't cancel me. I just spoke too hastily. I know that we don't agree, but please, please, please don't cancel. Please don't set the mob on me.
This concludes another episode of InFi, The Future of Finance, with Dr. Robert Murphy. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the host and for previous episodes, visit InFi, thefutureoffinance.io. Thanks for listening.